now know why I was moved to come to Colorado, because its weather is schizophrenic. Well, probably more appropriately DID, but I won't get into that. That's a longer, sordid history from my past. But welcome. I am Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host for the Psych Monologues. I am coming to you on May 23rd. It's been a couple of weeks, maybe a week. Nope, it's been a couple of weeks. I had to recover from my graduation ceremonies and saying goodbye to so many special students, and also just trying to get some grading done, which is also a unique experience, at least for me, particularly when I have a class that, especially when I have a class that is on crisis and trauma, and I read nothing but 30-plus case studies, and after a while, they kind of catch up to you with some of the reading that I've been doing. Interesting stuff, very interesting stuff, but some pretty heart-wrenching stories, to be sure, that my students take some time to take apart and try to understand and try to fashion some way of intervening. That is their first attempt at becoming part of the story for somebody that is going through a crisis of some sort. So it's been a couple of weeks of recovery in a lot of ways for me, and now I'm here, and I'm on the backside, which I'll probably take some time to explain here in a second, but I'm on the backside of our second retreat in the spring for our alumni from CCU and from doing silent retreats, and it was delightful. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Let me explain what this is if you're wondering who the heck you're listening to, or you lost a bet and now you have to listen for however long I decide to torture you. But the Psych Monologues is a podcast that explores the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. And as far as I can tell, and I haven't done an exhaustive search, but I have heard by way of good report from other people that are familiar with websites. So what I'm trying to do here is relatively unique. Because in a lot of cases, you will hear plenty of people talking about faith and spiritual formation, and you'll hear plenty of people talking about faith and psychology. But rarely are you going to end up finding somebody that wants to talk about all three of those things in some fashion or form. Of course, the minute you start adding a third, it makes now a three-dimensional model that we're talking about, and that's what I'm always up for a challenge, so I thought I would take that on, partly because it is very much a part of my passion, if you will, for the next generation of Christian leaders and Christians that a lot of them are fleeing the church, some of them are staying and still not being able to make sense of it, and really are searching for a different way to think about and talk about their faith, and that's to some degree what I'm trying to offer in doing this podcast. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax. Let's talk about the issues that matter to you the most, where you live, what you think, how you feel about living life with yourself and with others, and ultimately with Jesus. And so as I was saying, I am on the backside of another retreat, and I said to my co-leader this morning, God just never ceases to amaze us in terms of what he does in touching people's hearts, moving people's hearts. Sometimes that doesn't always mean remarkable movements of drama, like lightning bolts or audible speaking or anything like that. But inevitably, people that get involved in the silent retreats go in with some expectations, and they don't really know what they are until we get to the end, and it's like, well, wow, this wasn't what I expected. And in some respects, it's not always heavy, deep, and real. In some respects, the silent retreat simply offers them a permission, maybe even the freedom, to take time to rest, and that rest is what creates the space for them to consider life consider some of the decisions they're making, where they're heading, maybe how burned out they feel, whatever it might be. It seems like it creates this space to be honest with ourselves, and that's one way to do that. Now, that may not look overtly, and I underscore overtly, Christian, but it is very obviously a honest attempt to live life in the presence of Christ. And the Holy Spirit is very much a part, and it always is. I don't think the value of a silent retreat is built on how often somebody cracks their Bible in these 2.5 days. I think oftentimes more remarkable things happen just in the connection to other people. And so what we're trying to do with the silent retreat and how we've structured it is to be well suited for the generation of people that it feels to me at least like God has called me to be a part of, invited me to, not really called. Called seems like if I say go scratch to God, I don't want to do that, then I'm being disobedient, but I'm invited to. I don't have to. God doesn't operate that way. He operates on freedom. And so there is a sense of purpose and direction and a resonance of tone that it seems like I've been humbly given to take advantage of, and that's really kind of what this is all about. So we had 7 alumni come with us over the weekend, and we started Thursday evening. That's how we always start. And we start to talk about, we start to talk about what people hope, what they expect, maybe even what they fear, which is always a part of that. That's one of those things that we rarely want to admit. But it's also the baseline for how we enter into experiences like this. So we go into an experience not really being honest. We go into it saying, I don't know that I have any expectations, when in fact I do. And then when things start not happening the way I wanted them to, even though I haven't even admitted that what it is, then I get disappointed or angry or irritated or frustrated with God or anyone else for that matter. Or we're tempted into comparing what we're doing to someone else and saying, I must not be doing it right. I'm missing something. There's got to be something that I'm doing or I should be doing for this to quote unquote work, whatever that is. So I'm going to talk about that. I've been percolating a thought on that, and I'll do that for the next episode, and you can listen to it on the 30th. But tonight, what I want to talk about is it's entitled "Experiencing Joy or Generating Joy." Now, you can substitute whatever you want in for joy. It potentially can take me into a far longer conversation about what's the difference between joy and happiness, and just on a cursory level. Excuse me, my goodness. Let me take a drink here a second. Even on a cursory level, happiness, the very nature of the word happiness, has as its roots the same as happenings. And by definition, it's temporal, it's temporary. It comes and then it goes, and then we get disappointed because it doesn't persist, when happiness is not something that necessarily persists over time. And I need to be able to look at it carefully and understand it carefully so that I can understand what it is I'm talking about. I don't know if that made any sense at all. I just got a phone call But the thing I want to talk about, explore about tonight is it seems like there are people that want to correct the universe. Yeah, they probably fit in this category of what you might call the director of the universe kind of thing. And there are people that seem to want to generate joy, and then there are people who who have learned simply how to experience joy. And some of that comes from a lifestyle approach, like I am going to wring out of life everything it has to offer me, versus I'm going to engage life for all that it brings to me. So the thing that I mentioned just a minute ago is that it seems like there are folks that we come into contact with, and the curmudgeon and cynic in me has to grit my teeth and bite my tongue because it just seems like if somebody were to say, today's just been a bummer of a day, their first response is, yeah, but. And so they're going to correct things to say, well, there must be something good that happened. I wonder what would happen if you actually said to them, no, nothing good has happened, so leave me alone. But it seems like they're on this constant effort to generate joy or generate positivity, as if that is going to help the internal state of that person. And that's where I begin to get a little irritable, which is probably an understatement. But they seem to be bent on counterbalancing things. So if somebody is negative, they're going to always be the positive ones. Now, in a lot of cases, even when they're negative, all right, define that however you want. Even when they're negative, they do it to themselves. And I've met a lot of people, I'm sure you probably have as well, that just say, I just want to focus on positive thoughts. Well, that's great. But there are times where that kind of thing is as you've probably heard the phrase, is putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It's like, I just want to be positive. I don't want to focus on the negative, even though the negative is completely consistent with reality. And so these folks are always seemingly the ones that are attempting to kind of tamp down expectations. And well, I should say the opposite. In other words, they're trying to counterbalance the world around them. And the thing that always came to my mind, because I've talked to people for a long, long time, is like, why do people do that? Why? Why do they take it upon themselves to keep the universe in balance? And some of that, there's a subtle arrogance to that. In other words, I am my self-appointed balancer of things in people's lives, particularly people close to me, and it really is not born out of a spirit of maliciousness or anything at all. They just feel very duty-bound to try to counterbalance things. And if somebody's too negative, then they come up with something positive to offset it. The problem is that when we do that, or if you're one of those people that has that tendency to do that, you got to think through how the other person is receiving it. Not so much about what you're bent on accomplishing, but how is it received? Because in a lot of cases, I would suggest to you that when we do something like that, we actually run the risk of the other person feeling as if what they had to say was really quite irrelevant. And we weren't willing to give it the validity that it had particularly the validity that it has from their perspective. Now, you can pull out Scripture from a lot of different places in Scripture about when Paul says, count it all joy, for example. The problem is we can't build a doctrine on one or two verses about being thankful in negative circumstances. And I'm not denying the reality of those at all. That's true. But the question is, do I have to generate it to make it so? Or if I'm willing, and this is what is kind of the crux of the issue that I want to push at. If I'm willing to live in the reality of the world that I'm in, and there are negative things that are going on. There are things that are discouraging and disappointing and disillusioning to me, to anyone. If I'm willing to live in that and admit that indeed that feels like a gut punch, and I can't seemingly draw the air in enough into my metaphorical lungs to breathe, is it really accomplishing anything to say, yeah, but I'm still alive? Versus, this really sucks. And there's nothing to add. There's nothing else to say. It's just that, period. And then allowing some measure of validity of that to exist. And I would suggest that there is the possibility here that if I were to do that, there might actually be a space being opened for living in reality as it is, and then perhaps finding or experiencing points of joy, points of needs being met, places and moments of connection that are completely unexpected, but they're still remarkable. And I think this happens all the time, right? I mean, we have our heads set on how things are, or how, better yet, how things should be. And when it doesn't go that way, we continue to work on it. We continue to do things, say things, try to frame things, try to do something to bring it into conformity with how we think it should be. And by doing so, we end up missing how things really are. Even the most awful things, there are moments and small places of God's movement in it that I can catch sight of if I'm not going to be so demanding about how things should be. And see, what it really comes down to, what it really, really drives down to, is, do I trust God to still be present in this negative state that I'm in the difficulties that I'm in? And in a lot of cases, we say, no, it's not possible, because if I do that, then I lapse into, well, God made this happen. God intended this to happen. God engineered this to happen, and that makes him just a celestial sadist. And I don't think I want to serve that kind of God. Or I can have a broader perspective on it and say, we live in an incredibly, which we tend to underestimate, an incredibly broken world, including ourselves being broken. And we underestimate the contaminating effect of that brokenness in so many different things, that all we want is someone to blame, and then things will get better. Really? Do they really get any better? Do I gain anything by blaming God about something? Feels better. Feels like at least I know who to put it, whose doorstep to put it on. But what does it do, actually, for seeing that I live in a universe of a God who dramatically and persistently and passionately entered into our world as one of us, took on all of the very things that we're talking about, the injustice and the man's inhumanity to man, and the disappointment and all of it, taking it all on. He didn't have to do that. He could have just waved his hand and made it happen. But he didn't. What I'm getting down to is it's the issue of trust. And so often it is. And the thing that I assert, and I assert it so often that if anybody out there who's listening is a student of mine, they know where I'm going to be heading, because there are two basic axioms around the issue of trust. And that is, trust and control cannot coexist. If I can't find things that are trustworthy, or even God being trustworthy, then I will commit myself to controlling everything around me. And whether or not it actually works is irrelevant. At least I can find some measure of power out of it. The other axiom is trust and risk always go together. Always. You can't trust without risk. And that's what's so intolerable for so many of us in our interactions with each other, in our interactions with ourselves, in our interactions with the world around us, and right down to our interactions with God. Because he is thoroughly, stubbornly uncooperative with our attempts to try to control him through contracts. If I do this, then God will do that. And that's exactly what I think is at the crux of some of this issue of, am I willing to trust him enough to live in reality as it really is, as distasteful and awful and maybe even catastrophic as it is, to open up the boundaries of my universe, to have a wider horizon, to actually catch a glimpse of joy in those moments, and then I get to experience it rather than I'm going to generate it here. I'm going to say that something is good that isn't because I know that's what I'm supposed to do, rather than have it flow out of my actual experiencing at the time that it occurs. Now, this all connects back to my favorite subject, which I started with, and that's talking about the silent retreat. So often, there are people that come in with high expectations of something dramatic's going to happen as a result of this, and walk away thoroughly disappointed and angry that God didn't show up, in spite of the fact that they are surrounded by people who, with very little knowledge, offer them grace and love and presence and doing all the things that maybe they don't ever do on the outside of a silent retreat. And they say, well, God didn't show up. No, that the God that you predicted or you said was supposed to show up didn't show up, but God did show up. Because after all, people don't have to do those things. They choose to, and they choose based on, they make that choice based oftentimes on promptings of the Holy Spirit that they don't even know it's the Holy Spirit, but they still do. And you can say, well, it's obligatory, and they're being nice, and it really is our effort to be blind to what's being offered us. And I've had that happen so many times, I can't count it anymore. I've done it myself, where I so desperately want, quote unquote, God to show up, but I don't even bother to say, so how am I going to determine that God shows up? And if I burrow into that, drill into that, what I'll find is I have a list of conditions that would tell me that God shows up. And I'm so busy looking at those sorts of things that I don't see when he actually does. in ways that I don't expect, or in ways, when it comes down to it, I don't define. And that's the biggest challenge that we have, and I think we face, even in our faith. So can I be grateful when something bad happens? I could generate gratitude. I could state gratitude. I could assert gratitude. Or I could choose to delay on that point, understanding that life still proceeds, my engagement with it still proceeds, and at a later point in time when my perspective has changed, then perhaps I might experience gratitude instead of asserting it because I'm supposed to, because that is what's going to get me through this. And hopefully you get the gist of what I'm talking about. Because I find it very difficult to believe that God is calling us to call life something other than it is and live in a life that we're not living, but it's the way it, quote unquote, should be or is supposed to be. Jesus didn't do that. I was reminded this weekend, somebody had mentioned in our group about the full text of the Serenity Prayer. And most people only know the first 4 lines of the Serenity Prayer. And if you go deep into the full text of it, what you'll find is it says something to the effect of accepting as Jesus did the world as he found it to be, as it was. Not as he would have it, because could he have made it that? Yeah, of course. He was part of the original creation. But accepting it as it is so that he could enter into the experiences of the people that were part of that reality. And I would suggest to you that we're called to do exactly the same thing. We don't have to make it better than it is. It's not very good. There's lots of times it's not very good. It isn't. And I would be lying if I were to say that it's good. It isn't. But there's always a however in that statement. And the however is, if I'm willing to live with the reality of saying it's not good, it might actually expand my horizon of view to actually see good, to see where joy is, to see and experience these things that are all listed as fruit of the Spirit. Remember, it's a fruit of the Spirit. It is not an objective list of spiritual characteristics. The reality is fruit happens as a result of cultivation. It doesn't just happen. I have to cultivate an apple tree that at first doesn't look like anything at all except a bare stick. But I cultivate it and care for it and feed it and water it and fertilize it and everything else and prune it at various times. And then what do I experience? I get to experience its fruit. And that's true for any number of things that we talk about even within this podcast is, am I focusing on just the production, or am I focusing on the really important part of it, and that is the process? The best farmers are the ones that are focusing on process. The fruit, to some degree, will take care of itself if they have a good process. And if you're ever interested in seeing that, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it was probably a good while ago. But a few years back, Acura did a wonderful commercial, and not a single word was spoken in it. It was all conveyed by looks and something of a sleight of hand, if you will. And it portrays the process that Acura goes through to produce the cars that come off the line. In other words, the process they go through, how meticulous they are, how caring and specific their engineers are. And the punchline of the whole thing, the only time that the narrator says anything verbally, is that when you don't see them as dummies, something special happens. And oftentimes I show that to my students, and I say, when you don't see people, when you see people as persons that are endowed with the image of God, something sacred happens. And that's true for even how we view ourselves. Because increasingly we live in a world that wants to objectify ourselves, let alone objectify other people. And I'm not talking about lust or anything like that. When I look at somebody and see them as a means to an end, I have just objectified them, rather than as a person to know, a person to experience. And so we can find ourselves in either of these camps, generating some kind of emotion, generating some kind of gratitude, generating something of what Christian characteristics we think we should have, rather than doing the cultivation work so that we experience those things, not because we have generated them, but we experience them because we have caught sight of them in the moment. And I would say that's even more powerful, because then suddenly you see a universe that is inhabited by a God who so passionately loves us that he gives us these little clues that say, I'm still here, I still love you, I'm still right on your heels. I can't make your decisions for you, but I'm still right on your heels. And it may be through other people. I said that to somebody today at the retreat. And he was saying something to the effect of this, that he didn't think God showed up. And another member of the group spoke up and said something reflected back to him about the kinds of things that he had just said. And I looked at him and I said, it seems to me God just spoke. And it seems so mundane. And some people might say, well, you're really overstating it. Am I? Am I really? I guess it depends on whether or not you see the universe as a former spiritual director of mine used to say, as a universe that is saturated with God. It's inhabited by God. I've had plenty of people say that to me, that when they go on the silent retreat, they always thought of silence as something that is empty. There's nothing there. And what is so jarring is they walk away and find out and realize that silence is inhabited. It creates a window of meeting the God of the universe, who allows himself into time to meet us in silence and solitude. So that's another rant that I can get off on. So my apologies for some of the interruptions at the very beginning of the podcast. That's the nature of my life coming back from the silent retreat, is I end up trying to catch up, and I get errant phone calls and things like that. So anyway, let me finish out the evening just with the usual program reminders. We are still in need and continue to be in need for people that are willing to partner with us to put these retreats on. We have 2 scheduled in the fall, and now we're about 4 months away, but we have 2 scheduled in the fall for students that want to participate in it. And if we can begin to keep that focus, I know that it gets pretty overbearing for me to mention it each and every time. But if you want to partner with us, we would be ever so grateful to make it possible for students to participate in this kind of support for and fashioning of their spiritual formation at a very formative time of their lives that will take them, launch them into their full, quote unquote, full adult lives. So if there's anything I've said and you have questions, DM me on Instagram. You can subscribe to the website at drmitch.com. You can follow me on Instagram at the Psych Monologues, Facebook, Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn, Dr. Mitch. Those are the three major kind of social media outlets and channels that I inhabit. Apparently, I also have a Twitter feed, which I am still getting used to mentioning, but that's also the Psych Monologues again as well. Please subscribe to us on whatever platform you use to consume and listen to podcasts. We can be found on Spotify or Stitcher or iTunes or Podbean or Amazon Music or iHeartRadio. Any of those places you will find the Psych Monologues to be able to subscribe. If some of the things that you've heard or some of the things I've said that have been encouraging or thought-provoking or something like that, write a review. Allow us to be able to raise our profile, to pass on what you're hearing and what encouragement you're finding to other people that you care about that might want to be able to engage in this thing that's called podcasting. So, and like I mentioned, if you want to partner with us, please do so. You can have your gifts be tax deductible, and you can make them out to the CCU Silent Retreats. There is a donation button at the bottom of our front page. You can just go right down to the bottom. It says Donate Now. Either you can donate monthly, which is hugely helpful as far as the continuing growth of our silent retreats, but you can also make a one-time gift through that using a PayPal or a credit card. If you'd rather contribute through a check, you can do that as well. You make your check out to 1615.tv. That is our fiscal sponsor. And then address your envelope the same way, 1615.tv, P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado, 80104. So that's it for tonight. Thanks so much for joining me. It is a privilege to share a half an hour or so of your time. And I look forward to getting together again next week. So until then, love ya. Later. Bye.